Hello and welcome to a special BriefingsDirect Thought Leadership panel discussion on how the Open Group is spearheading ways to make smart cities initiatives more effective. Many of the latest technologies, such as Internet of Things platforms, big data analytics, and cloud computing, are making data-driven and efficiency-focused digital transformation more powerful. But exploiting these advances to improve municipal services for cities and urban government agencies face unique obstacles. Challenges range from a lack of common data sharing frameworks to immature governance over multi-agency projects to the need to find investment funding amid tight public sector budgets. The good news is that architectural framework methods, extended enterprise knowledge sharing, and common specifying and purchasing approaches have solved many similar issues in other domains. We will now explore how the Open Group is ambitiously seeking to improve the impact of smart cities initiatives by implementing what works organizationally for among the most complex projects. I'm Dana Gardner, Principal Analyst at Inter Arbor Solutions, and I'll be your host and moderator as we now examine the future of smart cities programs. With that, please join me in welcoming our panel. We're here today with Dr. Chris Harding, Chief Executive Officer at Lacabus. Welcome, Dr. Harding.
Thank you, Dana. It's a pleasure to be on the podcast, and I'm looking forward to a great discussion.
We're also here with Dr. Palib Saha, Chief Architect at the Open Group. Welcome.
Thank you, Dana. It's great to be on this panel, and I look forward to a very involving discussion.
Don Brancato joins us. He's Chief Strategy Architect at Boeing. Welcome, Don.
Thanks very much, Dana, and I appreciate joining the call.
We're here, too, with Don Sunderland, Deputy Commissioner, Data Management and Integration, New York City Department of IT and Telecommunications. Welcome, Don Sunderland.
Thank you. I'm very much looking forward to the conversation.
And filling out our panel is Dr. Anders Lisdorf, Enterprise Architect for Data Services for the City of New York. Welcome, Dr. Lisdorf.
Thank you, and thanks for having me.
Well, let's get to it. Chris Harding, why are urban and regional government projects different from other complex digital transformation initiatives?
Well, I think municipal projects have differences and also similarities as compared with corporate projects in enterprises. But the most fundamental difference, I think, is in the motivation. If you're in a commercial enterprise, your bottom line motivation is money, to make a profit and return on investment for the shareholders. If you're in a municipality, then your chief driving force really should be the good of the citizens. And money is just a means to achieving that end. So I think that is bound to affect in a lot of ways the way that you approach problems and the way that you solve problems. Although a lot of underlying issues that you have will be the same as a corporate enterprise will face.
Anyone else on the panel have anything to add in terms of what makes regional and urban government projects different?
This is Don Brancato. I'd just like to, and you'll appreciate this, Mr. Southern, the idea is that within big companies, we expect that our CEO is sort of leading the top of a hierarchy that looks like a triangle. And the CEO can sort of do a cause and effect that, looking at instrumentation, global markets and drivers and so on to affect strategy and what an organization will do, and it's top down. But if you take that triangle, turn it upside down, the way a city works is that often it's the voters, it's the masses of people who empower the leader, and that triangle goes upside down. So you'll think of the flat part of the triangle now as the top, and this is where voters are. And so it's not simply making the city a mirror of what we think of in our big corporations. I think so we've got to deliver value. So in that, I think there's sort of three levels that the big companies do, and that's one is instrumentation, sort of getting sensors and delivering data. Second is data crunching, the ability to churn that data into something meaningful in terms of information. And lastly, urban informatics, which ties back to the voter, who keep leaders in power and deliver value to the city by their participation and involvement and their continued voting in of leaders. So I think we have to observe those two different angles in order to understand the smart city.
Yeah, anyone else on this?
Yeah, I will go ahead. The two things which make smart city projects more complex in my view and from my perspective is Typically, in the context of large countries, what happens is we have multi-level governments. So you could have, you have a government at the federal level, you could have government at a provincial level or a state level, and then you could have a government at the city level. So one of the complexities that this brings into the overall equation is that cities therefore have to, at some level, align to what the state that it belongs to and the national level, digital transformation initiative and architecture-led initiatives needs to come in. So that is one level of complexity that the cities have to, factor in their planning. And the second part is in many countries around the world, in many large countries around the world, typically cities are headed by mayors, and in many cities the mayors are merely ceremonial positions, which means that they actually have very little authority in terms of how the city actually runs, because the city may belong to a state, and the state might have a chief minister or a premier, for instance, and at the national level you could have a president or a prime minister, and the overall the governance hierarchy needs to be factored in when the smart city projects are undertaken. So these are the two factors which actually bring in some level of complexity and some level of differentiation in terms of how smart city projects are planned and how they need to be implemented.
Don Sunderland, you had something to offer, please?
I did. I agree with pretty much everything that's been said so far. There are, in the particular case of New York City, and I think with a lot of cities in the U.S., the cities are fairly autonomous. They aren't greatly bound to the states, so they have an opportunity to go in a direction that they set. The problem is, of course, the idea of long-term planning in a political context. Corporations can choose to create multi-year plans, especially depending upon the scale of the products that they're producing. Within cities, of course, there's going to be a forced changeover of management every few years, and sometimes it's difficult to actually implement a meaningful long-term approach in that way, so they have to be more reactive in what they do. And one of the things that can drive a greater continuity is actually to create demand around the services that smart cities could produce. Under Mike Bloomberg, when he launched 311 and when he launched nyc.gov, he had a basic philosophy, which is, you should basically implement change that can't be undone. If you do something like offer the people the ability to reduce 10,000 phone numbers to 3 digits, that's going to be hard to reverse. And the same thing is true if you offer them a simple URL where they can go to at least start the process of trying to facilitate the services that they need. And like fashion, I think you really have to come up with a kind of killer app to which you habituate the residents, and they can drive basically the demand for further services on the basis of it. But in the abstract, planning the delivery of services without somehow having a demand developed by the user base itself is pretty difficult when basically by definition cities and governments have a captive audience. They don't have to. Right. They don't have to pander to the demands. I mean, whereas the private sector is going to go out of business if they don't respond to the demands of their client base. That's not the case in the public sector. What public sector has to do is really focus on being able to provide products and tools that can generate that demand and keep it coming in order to be able to create the political impetus to deliver on the demand.
Anders Lisdorf, it sounds like there's a bit of a chicken and an egg here, that you want to be able to come up with a killer app that can draw in attention and make more people call for services, but you have to put in place the infrastructure and the data frameworks in order to create that killer app. How does one overcome that chicken and egg relationship between technical assets and resources foundationally and the profile, high-level, highly visible applications?
Yeah, so the biggest challenge with this is, especially when you're working in government and so on, is that you don't have one place to go. You have several different agencies with different agendas and different preferences for how they would like their data and how they would like to share it and so on. This is the challenge for any sort of enterprise architecture, because you can't work from the top down. You can't specify your architectural roadmap. You have to pick the moments where it's convenient to do a project that will fit into your larger picture and so on. So it's very different working in enterprise and putting all these data structures in place in city government, especially in New York.
Dr. Harding, what do we need to do to perhaps find a way to move past that chicken and egg tension? What needs to change, in your opinion, for increasing the ability for technology to be used to its potential in these smart cities initiatives?
Well, I think that was a great point that Anders just brought up, that there are typically lots of different parts of the city government responsible for implementing these systems, and to a certain extent they're acting independently and autonomously. And I suspect that this is actually a problem that cities share with corporate enterprises. A very large corporate enterprise may have a central function, but often that is quite small in comparison with the very large divisions that it is coordinating, and those divisions often act with a degree of autonomy. So I think in both cases, the challenge is that you have a set of independent governance domains and they need to share data. And I think what is needed is some kind of framework that will allow this data sharing to happen. And this framework really has to be at two levels. It has to be at a policy level, and that is going to vary from city to city or from enterprise to enterprise, but it also has to be at a technical level, and I think there can be a supporting technical framework that can help the enterprises or the cities to achieve data sharing between their independent governance domains.
Dr. Saha, do you agree that the data framework common approach is one of the key necessary steps to improve how things are going?
Yes, definitely. Having common data standards across different agencies and having a framework to support that interoperability between agencies is a first step. But as Dr. Anders was mentioning earlier, it is not easy for getting the agencies to collaborate with one another or share data with one another, because this is not a technical problem. It's obviously, as Chris was saying, we need policy-level integration, which integrates both vertically and horizontally across different agencies. One way that I have seen that seems to work in certain parts, certain cities, is that certain cities have set up urban labs where certain services which the city architects think are important from a citizen perspective or the residents of the city perspective, those services are launched and they're kind of more like a proof of concept in the urban lab, so that at least you can make a assessment whether the demand and supply are actually aligned to one another. Obviously, it is a chicken and egg problem, and we need to go beyond frameworks, beyond policies to get to a point where citizens can try out certain services. And when I use the word services, I'm looking at integrated services across the different agencies or service providers, that belong to the city. The fundamental principle here for the citizen of the city is that there is no wrong door. He or she can approach any department or any agency of the city and get a service, because the citizen, in my view, is approaching the city authority, not a specific agency or department of the city.
Don Brancato, it seems that if citizens are perceiving a gap between what they can do in their private lives, perhaps at a hypercloud e-commerce portal, that they can order almost anything on the planet and have it show up in 2 days, there might be an expectation for having better city services or government services. Is that a way for us to get to an improvement in smart cities, that people start calling for a city and municipal services to be on par with what they can do almost anywhere else?
You're exactly right, Dan. I mean, that's what's driven the DIY movement, is that you go to work and use a cell phone at home, for instance, and you expect that you should be able to integrate that same cell phone in a secure way at work. And so that transitivity is expected, that I should, if I can go to Amazon and get a service, why can't I go to my office or to the city and get a service? And so in that, some of the tactical things that we can do that align with some of the thoughts that I've heard about frameworks is, in delivering value, is the notion that, first off, that a citizen in many countries and cities is going to exercise their disruption or displeasure by their vote or by moving to some other place and just no longer working there, being there. But traceability is one of the things I think that we should imagine, that if I have some service, it's traceable to some city strategy, it's traceable to some data that goes with it. So the traceability model is in its abstract form, the idea that if I'm collecting data, it should trace to some service, and it allows me to build some body of metrics to show continuously how services are getting better. Because data, after all, is the enablement of the city, and it proves it by demonstrating metrics that show that value. So in your catalog idea, absolutely, I should be able to exercise the catalog. There should be data that shows its value, and the repeatability and reuse of that service can be seen by all the participants in the city.
Don Sunderland, if we have citizens that are seeing a gap between what they can do in the private sector and what they want in public services, if we know that a common data framework is an important element to making that happen, why don't we just have someone legislate and say, you will implement a common data framework? Why don't we have, if not a top-down CEO structure, a top-down legislative function that puts in place common approaches to technology issues that then foment into great applications?
Well, there have been some fairly successful legislative actions vis-a-vis making data available and more common. The Open Data Law, which New York City passed back in 2012, is an excellent example of that. However, the ability to pass a law does not guarantee the ability to solve all the problems that would be required to actually execute it. And in the case of the type of fluidity of service that you can get from Amazon, that implies a uniformity not only of standards, but oftentimes of platform. And that just doesn't exist. In a place like New York City, you have 100 different entities, 50 to 60 of them agencies providing services to the city of New York who've built vast legacy systems that don't interoperate, and it would take a massive investment for you to make them interoperate. So what you have to do is you have to have a kind of going forward type of strategy. So the idea of adopting standards and frameworks going forward is probably one approach you can take, with the idea of you will grow there, the idea of creating a law that tries to implement a kind of like Amazon or Facebook uniformity is one that would be doomed to failure just because nobody could actually afford to implement it. And I think, in leveraging this problem to the earlier problem of, okay, since you can't do really top-down solutions, even if you pass a law, it doesn't mean that you can actually implement it in a meaningful way. Probably the other way to do it is to look at those bottom-up opportunities, to look at kind of building your standards and your governance opportunistically around specific centers of interest that arise, where you find agencies who begin to understand they need each other's data in order to be able to get their jobs done effectively in this new age, and to kind of build that interconnectivity and that governance and standards building from the bottom up as opposed to the top down.
Dr. Chris Harding, when we've seen in other organizations a siloed type of affair, when we know that we can't force everyone into a common framework or common platform, interoperability has come to the rescue, often a standardized methodological approach to interoperability. So where are we in terms of saying, okay, if we can't get them all on the same platform and the same data model, how do we foment increased interoperability, and is that part of what the Open Group hopes to accomplish?
Well, that's certainly part of what the Open Group hopes to accomplish. But I think it's not, Don was absolutely right, it's not something that you can legislate for. I think attempts to legislate standards top-down have generally not been very successful, whereas encouraging organic growth and building on opportunities has been successful. I mean, you can take the prime example, the Internet that we all know and love, which grew organically at a time when governments around the world were trying to legislate for a different technical solution, OSI, for those that remember it. And that, I think, is a fairly common experience. The attempt to say, well, we know what the standard has to be, we will legislate and everyone will do it this way, often falls on its face. But to pick something that is demonstrably there and is working, and to say, okay, well, let's all do it kind of like that, can have huge success, as indeed the Internet obviously has done. And I hope that we can build on that in the sphere of data. It's interesting, actually, that Tim Berners-Lee, who is the inventor of the Internet, is now turning his attention to the data space and has come up with this idea of the personal data pod, which maybe represents a part of the solution, or at least to the the growth of standardization in the data area that we will need if we're going to have the kind of framework that will help governments and cities to organize their IT infrastructure.
Dr. Lisdorf, do you agree that the organic approach is the way to go, 1,000 roof gardens, and then let the best fruit win the day?
I think that is probably the only way to go because, as I said earlier, any top-down way of controlling data initiatives in the city are bound to fail, in my opinion.
All right. Let's look at the cost issues as well, because in the private sector you have an operating expenditure budget, OPEX. You can budget for things and pay for them in advance, or capital expenditures, probably even more so. So what is it about the funding process that also is an impediment, perhaps, to smart cities initiatives, and how might we overcome that? And I'll throw that out to anyone.
This is Don Brancato. As we answer that, Mr. Sutherland should really answer that one, because I think that he gives a brilliant answer on that one. But to echo and provide a funnel for what Dr. Harding suggested, this notion that cost and latency, I think, will drive a funnel to our digital worlds and force vendors into a world of interoperability in that data piece that he specified. So cost and latency seems to be the thing that we're competing with within the cities that we work with. And then ultimately what it will do in order to improve on that is that we'll have to be more interoperable and adopt these data standards. But Mr. Sutherland, I mean, you give a brilliant answer that I've reused lots in some of the smart city work that I've had in terms of OPEX and CAPEX.
Sure. Thanks, Don. One of the great educations when you come to work in the public sector after having worked in the private sector is that the terms CAPEX and OPEX have quite different meanings within the context of the public sector. Governments, especially local governments, raise money through the sale of bonds. And within the government context on a local level, CAPEX implies anything that can be funded through the sale of bonds. And usually there's pretty specific legislation around what you're allowed to do that with. And most bond legislation and most city charters that you had that legislation embedded, and this is one of those places where we interact strongly with the state, stipulate specific requirements around what that kind of money can be used for. And traditionally it was used for things like building bridges and schools and fixing highways. There's not a lot about technology that reflects that. And what's happened is that the CAPEX has become less and less usable as we've moved more and more to the cloud, because the idea of actually having an asset that can be capitalized starts disappearing when you're buying services instead of licenses running on servers that you own. And this creates a real tension between the newer cloud architectures, which is where most modern data architectures are moving at this point, and the traditional data center-centric server-bound license architectures, which are easily fundable under capital expenditures. And it creates a huge dynamic. I mean, I think what really has to happen is that ultimately the rules around CAPEX in the public sector have to evolve to embrace the fact that, among other things, data is identifiably an asset. You can't really say that it has no value when there are whole business models being built around the valuation of the data that's being collected. So I think there's great hope for us being able to evolve, but for the time being there's this tension between creating the newer beneficial architectures and figuring out how to pay for them. And by the way, what that really comes down to is what you can pay for with bonds is not politically volatile. What you pay for with expense comes out of the taxes to the people, and that's extremely hard to come by and contentious. So it's traditionally been a lot easier to build new infrastructure, new projects, new approaches using capital assets rather than using expense.
Dr. Saha, doesn't the cloud that's been just raised, the public cloud, the hyperscaler cloud model, solve some of these problems? If you can go to an OPEX model where you pay per consumption, if you have a inherently common data model, an inherently common platform, if you could outsource the infrastructure, why won't municipalities just simply say, let's go all to the cloud and solve some of these problems? Is that a viable architectural approach?
It is, definitely. I mean, across the world, many governments, I'm not just limiting myself to city governments or local governments, even state, provincial, or even federal governments are moving to the cloud for this very reason. But one thing we have to keep in mind is that, at the city level, it is not necessary that all the services that the city provides need to be provided by an agency of the city. It could be on a public-private partnership model where the city authority or the agency collaborates or works together with a private party who comes and provides part of the service or the process. And therefore, the private party is, actually funded or is actually, allowed to raise some money in terms of what part of the service it provides. And many cities are addressing the problem of funding, through including, taking an ecosystem approach, because many cities have realized that it is absolutely not essential that all services must be provided by a government entity. So this is one way that cities are trying to address the constraint of limited funding that they have.
Dr. Lisdorf, in this actual city environment in New York, is a hyperscale public cloud model a silver bullet, or is the devil in the details, or is there a hybrid or private cloud model that should be considered?
I don't think it's a silver bullet. It's certainly convenient, but since this is a new technology, there are a lot of things that we need to clear up in how to take advantage of it, because this is a transition, and there are lots of issues surrounding that. One is the funding, which is like the city is still run in a certain way where you would buy the infrastructure yourself, and it has to change from the top how they prioritize budgets and how they allow funding of different initiatives. But you also have on-the-ground issues like the culture, because it's different working in a cloud environment, and the way of thinking is hard to change, because there is also a cultural inertia in how you design solutions and implement them, which is difficult. And then there is one of perception, because it is still, to many people in agencies and so on, the cloud is considered something dangerous or not quite safe and so on, whereas it's probably the other way around, that the cloud is a lot safer in terms of having resilient solutions and your data is safe and so on. So I think this is really a big thing to turn around, and it's not a simple silver bullet. And this is why I think for the foreseeable future we'll look at hybrid architectures for sure. So we'll kind of offload some use cases to the cloud where it's easy given those challenges that I mentioned, and then we'll gradually build on those successes in order to move more into the cloud, I believe.
Okay, so we've talked about some of the challenges. We've talked about some of the changeable requirements in a public sector environment for getting backing, getting funding, getting support. But let's look at what the Open Group can bring to the table. Dr. Saha, what can the Open Group do that's similar to past initiatives, perhaps around TOGAF as an architecture framework, or maybe looking at DODAF in the defense sector to when they had similar problems that they were able to solve? What is it that can be brought as a solution? And then we'll talk about what you might get as a result of some of these solutions. We'll start with Dr. Saha and go around the panel. How does the Open Group bring value to a solution approach to some of the issues we've been discussing?
Yeah, so what we have done in Open Group is very recently, as part of the Architecture Forum, we have set up a government enterprise architecture work group. And what I envisage is that within this work group, we will get to the point where we will start with developing a reference architecture for smart cities, because I think that is something that would be essential to kind of establish and kickstart the standard and the standardization journey around smart cities. Because cities around the world actually consider smart city completely differently, and they have a different notion and a perception of what a smart city is. One thing I would like to address here is that in many places, one of the reasons why smart city projects don't succeed to the extent that they were initially expected to succeed is because they are typically taken as an IT or a information technology initiative, which it is not. We all know that information technology or digital technology is an important element of smart cities, but it is, as I think in the previous questions that many people have said, it is also bringing the policy level, intervention. It is bringing the framework. It is bringing the cultural change. It is bringing the change management aspect into the overall ecosystem, if you will. So at the Open Group level and at the work group level, we would definitely like to get to a point where we develop a reference architecture. And I think at a more tactical level, we would like to support that reference architecture with certain implementations of more, I would say in-demand use cases, if you will. I understand that, and I think we all agree that we are not going to look at a top-down approach. No city will probably have the resources and even the political will to do a top-down approach. But and given that we are looking at a bottom-up or a middle-out approach, our thinking is that we need to identify use cases that are more likely to be successful in the context of smart cities and certain scenarios that will be relevant to apply those use cases. So this is the broad thinking that we have at the Open Group level within the Government Enterprise Architecture Work Group. But I think that this thinking will also evolve as the work group, gets to work and starts developing the reference architectures and the framework.
Dr. Harding, you've been involved with the Open Group for many years. You've witnessed the evolution of many of these working groups and framework approaches, methodological approaches. What do you think will work that extends from what Open Group activities have been successful in other areas to Smart Cities Initiative?
Well, I guess I should declare my background here. For many years, I was a staff member of the Open Group, but I left the Open Group staff at the end of last year, and I guess that gives me a slightly different perspective on the Open Group. Before I give that, though, I think I'd like to correct something I said earlier. I believe I referred to Tim Berners-Lee as the inventor of the Internet. That was a slip of the tongue. I obviously meant the World Wide Web, which is perhaps not quite the same thing. So my apologies for that, and I'd like to correct the misapprehension there. In terms of how the Open Group can contribute, I think that the Open Group is a really excellent body for developing an understanding of the situation. And it has participants from vendors, from users of information technology, and from the academic side as well to some extent. So a mix of participants with a mix of background and experience, and I think it is a great place to develop an understanding of what is needed and of what is possible. And I think as that understanding develops, it then becomes possible to start defining the standards. That personally I see standardization as kind of a crystallization process in which something solid and structured appears from a liquid with no structure. And I think that the key role that the Open Group plays in this process is a catalyst, and I think it can do that in this area too.
Don Brancado, same question. Where do you see the Open Group initiatives benefiting a positive evolution for smart cities?
Gosh, that's a great question, and that's likely to get many of us really excited, and this call would never end. So tactically, we've got a really nice story with a data exchange model that continues to grow with the Open Data Element Framework, and that's within the body of a number of different IoT and industrial IoT patterns that we've developed in the standards. And all of that ties together within Open Platform. And Open Platform goes up and ties into some of the work that's happening with, as the gentleman indicated earlier, within enterprise architecture in general and specifically with models like DODAF, MODAF, and TOGAF. So that said, we've got a really nice collection of patterns that are happening these days, and recognizing that data is the mechanism that ties it all together. So I would have a look at the Open Platform and the work that we're doing there that ties the notions of service catalog, which are the collection of activities that human systems or machines need in order to fulfill their roles and capabilities that tie to strategy. And further, the notion of data catalogs, which are the children of these service catalogs that provide the proof of the activities of human systems, machines, and sensors to the fulfillment of their capability and then traceable on up to their strategy. So I think we've got a nice collection of standards and a global collection of folks that are delivering that value today.
Don Sunderland, data management integration in New York City. What would you like to see as a consumer on the receiving end, if you will, of organizations like the Open Group when it comes to improving your ability to deliver smart cities initiatives?
You know, I like the idea of reference architectures attached to use cases because for better or for worse, when folks engage around these issues, even in large entities like New York City, they're going to be engaging around specific needs. And reference architectures are really great because they give you a nice kind of intuitive view of how things will fit. But the real meats in the use cases applied against the reference architectures themselves. And I think that idea of developing kind of the work groups work around initially a handful of reference architectures that seem to address specific use cases, and then allowing a catalog of those use cases so those who are actually going to facilitate those reference architectures can look for cases similar to the ones that they're attempting to resolve would be a good consumer-friendly way to provide a value add in the work that you're doing.
Well, there's obviously going to be a lot more to do at the Open Group, and a lot more information will be available there at www.opengroup.org. But before we sign off, and we're almost out of time, I think it might be useful for us to put a few brass rings up on the merry-go-round for us to think about grabbing, that if you do things better, if you can improve some of these frameworks and interoperability in standardization of data frameworks, of organic application and use case scenarios that well up inside of cities that empower people to call for more, what might they be? So let's go around before we close out and identify what might be possible and what might be very much attractive and a driver to future smart city initiatives. Let's start with Dr. Anders Listdorf. What do you see as a potential use case or application or service that could be a wedge to drive even more smart cities activities?
I think that one way to get in control of it, because right now smart cities initiatives are out of control. They're usually on an ad hoc basis and so on. I think that one place that would be important in order to get some sort of standardization enforced or at least considered for new implementations would be to integrate it as a necessary step in the procurement process, and also since cities usually have some sort of security process or governance around that, so in the security accreditation. So I think that one way to start thinking about this and implementing more structure would be whenever new smart cities initiatives are being implemented, you would need to run them through some sort of governance that are tied up to the funding and the security clearance of a solution. That's the only way we can start gaining some sort of control. And this will also work in the other direction, so that it can kind of push standardization towards vendors, because they don't care at all about any sort of standards. They have all their own. But if we include it in our procurement and our security requirements that they need to comply with certain standards, they will have to start building according to those standards, and that will increase the overall interoperability of smart cities technologies. I think that is actually the only way I see that we can start gaining control.
Dr. Chris Harding, what do you see as a shiny, bright object that people could shoot for that might drive further interest and adoption in improving smart cities undertakings?
Well, maybe the thing to focus on would be the policy around data sharing. As I mentioned, I see two layers of a framework, a policy layer and a technical layer, but I think that the understanding of the policy layer has to come first, because the technical layer would be supporting it. So the development of policy around data sharing, and maybe the specific shiny thing to focus on there is personal data, because it's a hot topic. Everyone is concerned with what happens to their personal data, and it's something that cities are particularly concerned with because they hold a lot of data about their citizens. So that would be my take as to the cherry to pick off the tree in the first instance.
Dr. Pallab Saha, same question to you. What would be your choice of the right cherry to pick first and foremost?
So I would look at it in two ways. One is for cities to adopt smart city approaches. What I have seen working is to identify very high demand use cases at a certain level, which could be pertaining to environment or mobility or economy or health or whatever it is, whatever is the priority for that city. So identifying high demand and high use cases are important, because the impact is directly seen by the people, which is very important, because the benefits of having a smarter city is something that needs to be visible to the people who are actually using those services, number one. The other part of the discussion that we have not spoken about is, I think in all our discussion and all the stuff that we have discussed now, is we have always assumed that the city already exists and we are retrofitting it to become smart cities. There are certain places where, certain countries where countries are actually building new cities. And these new cities, brand new cities, so to speak, are perfect examples of where some of these technologies could be tried out, because the cities are coming up new and they don't yet have the complexities of existing cities. So it becomes a very good lab, if you will. It's a real-life lab. It's not a control lab. It's a real-life lab where the services can be rolled out, as the city is being built and developed. So these are the two things, I think, which will improve the adoption of smart city technology across the globe.
Don Brancato, any ideas from your perspective on catalysts to get these standardization and improved approaches going?
I sure like Dr. Harding's bit on personal data, because that's a way that you can take essentially a group of people and build a tactical pattern and then grow back up and grow and reuse that. In terms of the broader city, I think that this, and I've seen this in a number of cities that we've been able to introduce successful programs, and that's using the notion of a safe city as a subset of the many smart city initiatives. This is one that particularly plays out to the public. There's a lot of reuse involved into it. It enables the city to reuse a lot of their metric capabilities and demonstrate that they can deliver value to the average citizen. So I don't want to lose track of the fact that in order to keep the city involved and energetic, that people move the cities because of all the cultural and things that one can be involved with in terms of education, its safety. There's a commoditization of price and of value and so on. And so the notion of being able to deliver safety, I think, is critical. So I'll mingle through those two patterns of personal data versus something like Safe City is the notion of traceability. Traceability is a thing that I think in the enterprise architecture world should be a standard artifact, assuring that any of the programs that we have that trace to citizen value, to business value in terms of business, that there's a traceability model that essentially links those numbered initiatives and strategies through the service all the way down to the data. So that essentially data can be tied to role. So if I'm a person, if I'm an individual, data can be assigned to me. If I'm some role within the city, data can be assigned to me. And the beauty of that story is that as we automate our cities, the role of the human is even compounded to the notion that the capabilities are done in the city by humans, systems, machines, and sensors that are getting increasingly smarter. And so there'll be data that's traceable to these sensors. So I think those are the three things that I would look for.
Thank you. Last word to Don Sunderland. What have you seen that works, and what should we be doing more of before we close out?
Well, I'm still kind of fixated on the idea of creating the demand, the direct demand. We can't generate it. It's there on many levels, but a kind of guerrilla tactic to tap into that demand would be to create location-aware applications, mobile apps, that were freely available to citizens, and take the existing data that you have, rather than trying to go out and solve all the data sharing problems that you need to solve every problem for a municipality, and start creating a value-added app that starts feeding people location-aware information about where they are, whether it comes from within the city or from without the city, and they become habituated to the idea of they can avail themselves of information and services directly, basically from their pocket when they need to, and then start adding layers of additional information as it becomes available. But creating the demand is what's key. When 311 was created, it became immediately apparent that it became a brand. Just because the idea of getting all those services, if they were being humanly facilitated in many instances by dialing those three digits, was not going to go away, and all of a sudden everybody wanted to add their service onto this 311. I think this kind of guerrilla approach to a location-aware app that was made available to the citizenry would be a way to drive that demand for a lot of people.
All right, well, I'm afraid we'll have to leave it there. We've covered a lot of ground, and we've been discussing how the Open Group is spearheading ways to make smart cities initiatives more effective. And we've learned how governmental transformation endeavors face unique challenges, but that such things as common data and standardized methods and frameworks could help support more efficiency and ultimately far better city services. For more information on this and other topics and events, please check out the Open Group website at www.opengroup.org. And please now join me in thanking our panel. We've been here with Dr. Chris Harding, Chief Executive Officer at Lacabus. We've also been here with Dr. Pallab Saha, Chief Architect of the Open Group. Don Brancato, Chief Strategy Architect at Boeing, has joined us. along with Don Sunderland, Deputy Commissioner, Data Management and Integration, New York City Department of IT and Telecommunications, and also we've been here with Dr. Anders Lisdorf, Enterprise Architect for Data Services for the City of New York. Thank you to all of you. And a big thank you to the Open Group for sponsoring this discussion. And lastly, thanks to our audience for joining. This is Dana Gardner, Principal Analyst at InterArborist Solutions, your host and moderator. Thanks again for listening, and do come back next time.